I'm Mark Milke with the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy. I've just shown you a view of downtown Chicago, some skyscrapers across my hotel room. I've been here for a few days, and I wanted to record a video about what's been happening here, but also across the rest of the United States and Canada, where the Aristotle Foundation is located, the so-called pro-Palestinian demonstrations, which are really pro-Hamas protests that have done everything from disrupt commencement ceremonies to show up in front of hospitals and coffee shops or occupy grounds and universities for longer than a reasonable protest of several hours. So let's go through what's happening, because it's important to understand what's happening and what's not happening, or the justifications for these protests as well. Let's start with the argument that these protests are merely about free expression. Well, if that were true, then they would be gone within several hours, show up, make their point, have a few placards, and then go about their merry business. But of course, that's not what's been happening, not in total. If you show up to university campus or in front of a hospital, as happened at Toronto's Mount Sinai Hospital, or if you prevent Jews from physically entering certain locations on a university campus, you're not engaged in mere free expression. You're engaged in something very different. You're using physical intimidation to block others from going about their daily life, other students who have paid for their education, as well as, by the way, their parents, taxpayers, and donors to a university, which all of those should think about, by the way. If you're a donor or you're a parent, you should be upset about what's happening at universities in Canada and the United States, and tell administrators to do something about it if you haven't already. But back to free expression. Free expression, as John Stuart Mill argued over a century and a half ago, is not about the right to interrupt someone else's rights. You don't get to physically intimidate, physically harass, physically stop other people from going about their daily lives. And that's what's been happening on some of these university campuses. You don't get to take over spaces and, by the way, demand what the administration should or shouldn't do with their investment dollars. Which leads to the second problem here. It's not just a misunderstanding about free expression. Although more than misunderstanding in some cases, some people know exactly what free expression is and isn't, and they're being disingenuous to suggest that these demonstrations are purely about free expression. The second problem here, of course, is how to think about Gaza, Hamas, and Israel. Let's go back to October the 7th, but also before October the 7th. The civilian casualties in Gaza as a result of October the 7th are akin to the civilian casualties in the Second World War. If you're going to blame Israel for civilian casualties now in Gaza, you might as well blame all the allies for 6 years' worth of civilian casualties in Europe, in East Asia, and elsewhere in the theaters of war during that war. To blame Israel additionally for what's happening in Gaza at this point is also to ignore 100 years of history. If you argue that somehow Israel has been unwilling to come to terms with the Arab world, or Palestinians in particular, there's a number of things that are missed in that claim. Number one, attacks on Jews have tragically happened for hundreds of years, for millennia, in various cultures. Recently, in Palestine and then Israel, attacks on Jews happened in the 1920s, akin to what happened on October the 7th. Or, before 1967, it wasn't like the pre-1967 borders were accepted by some in the region, which is why Israel got attacked prior to 1967. So if people say, well, the issue is 1967 borders, or the notion that somehow Israel hasn't been willing to do peace where it can with the right people, that's simply not factually true. Israel signed peace agreements in 1978 with Egypt and Jordan, the Camp David Accords. More recently, Israel has shown that it's been willing to do additional peace deals in the Abraham Accords. So the problem is on the Palestinian side and the leadership there, unfortunately. I was in Israel, by the way, and I was in Gaza, on the border with Gaza, in July 2005, when Israel was withdrawing from the Gaza Strip. And at that time, I asked Michael Oren, who was then a think tank scholar but became the future Israeli ambassador to the United States, why Israel was withdrawing from Gaza, given that it was getting nothing in return from the Palestinians. Oren was quite frank and quite realpolitik and quite blunt. He just said, look, you can't have several thousand Jews in Gaza and try and control that strip. It's not tenable. And he said Israeli mothers would no longer put up with their sons dying for that piece of territory any more than they wanted to put up with their soldiers dying in southern Lebanon, where Israel withdrew from in 2000. But Oren predicted that there would be rockets ad infinitum coming from Gaza into Israel. And in fact, one happened during the time I was in Israel in 2005. But again, I saw Israel withdraw from Gaza that year, and Palestinian leaders had a choice. They could have tried to build the West Bank and Gaza into Singapore. They could have tried to build it into Qatar. Instead, most of the leaders kept choosing terrorism. So that's important to the context of this debate about who is responsible for the tragedy of civilian deaths in Gaza post-October the 7th. Well, place the blame on Palestinian leaders. Remember as well that in 2000, Ehud Barak, the Israeli prime minister, Bill Clinton, the American president, both gave Yasser Arafat, then the leader of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and in Gaza, a potential peace treaty. They gave him 97% of what the Palestinians had demanded. Bill Clinton, in his biography, made a point of saying the young Palestinians wanted the deal, and Clinton himself thought there's no possible way that Arafat will turn down this deal. It's just too good. Except that's exactly what Yasser Arafat did. He walked away from the negotiating table, chose to continue to be a revolutionary terrorist, or a terrorist revolutionary, depending on how you want to order those two words, rather than do a peace deal, rather than do the boring stuff of build a nation state on the Mediterranean Sea in Gaza and in the West Bank right beside Israel. So the tragedy here has been on the Palestinian side. The tragedy has been that Israelis, whether left-wing or right-wing or however they want to describe themselves, have not had a reliable peace partner on the Palestinian side. Unlike Jordan, unlike Egypt, unlike the other countries with the Abraham Accords who did sign with Israel, and others who were willing to and were about to before October the 7th. So that's the second thing to remember. Not only is this not about free expression, as if physical intimidation is okay and physical harassment is okay, this is also about the failure on the Palestinian side. And then thirdly, what to do about all this on campuses. Again, I'm in Canada most days, except for this weekend. And the Aristotle Foundation is concerned about what's happening on Canadian campuses as well, whether it's Concordia in Montreal or McGill or other university campuses across the country, or protests that target Jews. What to do about this? Well, there's a good example from the University of Florida and Ben Sasse, the president there. He recently wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal pointing out that time and again, he and others have pointed out to protesters that they, the administration at the University of Florida, would defend their right to free expression, to free association, to gather and to protest. Those are the rights that he would back up. But when they cross the line into physical intimidation and other activities that are clearly prohibited on campus, that these protesters would be expelled, would be arrested, and would be banned from that campus for 3 years, which is exactly what's happened. So here's the big picture. Again, I'm in Chicago, and Chicago, of course, was the home of some famous demonstrations in 1968 at the Democratic National Convention, which were disruptive. And of course, there's the Berkeley free speech movement, which again, in some cases, was about a lot more than free speech. But free speech is one thing. Disrupting others' activities, disrupting the right of others to go about their daily life or the education they and their parents and donors have paid for, is quite different. So let's be clear about this. Free expression does not entail the right to physically intimidate others. There's a misreading, either naively or disingenuously about what's been happening in Gaza and the reasons why for that over decades and the last 100 years that predate Israel and before that even. And thirdly, how should we deal with protests on university campuses that get out of control? A line should be drawn that physical intimidation will not be tolerated, that breaking into buildings, preventing others from going about their business on campuses should also not be tolerated. So for more on this issue, we've got some analysis on our website and some past work on this, which you may want to check out. 5 reasons why Canadians should support Israel. Dr. David Burkeson, a wonderful historian at the University of Calgary, who also writes about the tragedy of civilian casualties in war, but who to properly blame. This is all on our website. You can check it out at aristotlefoundation.org. Again, I'm Mark Milke, president and founder of the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy.